Okay, the recording has started.
All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to session 4. Thank you for being here. We're looking forward to hearing from Professor Krishna. He'll be speaking for the first half an hour, 45 minutes, and then you can enter your questions into the chat. And then we'll do a formal Q&A and Krasimir will read your questions and Professor Krishna will answer them. If any questions are not answered because of time, we'll send them to him and he'll be answering them by email. So, Professor Krishna, take her away.
Thank you very much. Yeah, today the plan is to discuss what Krishnamurti has said in chapters 11 to 15. I hope most of you have had the time and opportunity to read them.
Sorry to interrupt in between.
Pardon?
Sorry to interrupt in between. Prasadji, as you have emailed me about some transcript in between converted of this video, same process happening today also. Somebody write something in chat regarding meeting AI meeting notes.
Yeah, that's okay. We are recording and it's available. Thanks for alerting me.
Okay.
And I think, Professor Krishna, are we doing 16 to 20 today or 16 to...
Yeah, 16 to 20.
16 to 20, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that was a mistake. Yeah. But the rest of what I said applies to this chapters also. They take us into deeper waters, and so we need to give a lot of attention, which doesn't mean that we should accept them, but we need to investigate and in order to really understand what he is trying to say. The essential thing in these chapters is that he is saying that the mind that is burdened by memories of the past, which include images, past conclusions, all the conditioning of religion and the particular culture where one has grown up, plus the knowledge that one has acquired through school, college, and university, if one has gone to university, and also one's own experiences. Because often these have misled us. And we are using this mind to solve our problems. And that mind itself is a problem because of all this conditioning. So he calls that a burden. He says, if you are carrying this burden of the past with you, then it's a sick mind. And you are trying to solve problems with a sick mind, which is the difficulty. So what is necessary is to drop this burden. And that's why we are in deeper waters. How do you drop this burden? Otherwise, the methods that we use themselves cause complications and add to the burden. He gives several instances of that in different chapters. One is that you are never in contact with solitude. You may not be with a companion. You may think you are alone, but your own mind is constantly chattering from this background. And therefore, you are not able to pay full attention to what you are seeing or listening. So seeing and listening have a distraction, constant distraction from this burden, which is constantly evaluating in terms of what it has known in the past. and feeling either elation or depression, and so on, which is all a ego process. We have gone into this before. The burden itself is not the ego, but the attachment to this burden. The attachment to the conditioning is the ego. Somehow we feel sure that what this conditioning is telling us is true. And that itself is an illusion. It is not true. Much of it is not true. And much of it has not been fully examined or seen to be true or false. Otherwise, the false would have dropped away. So until this drops away and you free your mind of this burden, the quality of your mind is compromised. And with a compromised mind, you're trying to solve your problems, including the problem of getting rid of this burden. So it's a very complex thing. You are using a mind, and that mind itself is corrupting your perceptions. So in one of the chapters, which goes very deep, the man says, you are saying you must have a healthy mind before you can get rid of the sickness. But if you have a healthy mind, there is no sickness. He said, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this sickness need not dominate in our consciousness, which means you have to realize that it is really a danger to carry this burden. Realize, which is not to conclude intellectually or rationally that it is a burden, that is easy to do, and you may agree with Krishnamurti, but that won't get rid of it. But if you are aware and watchful and see for yourself the danger of this, then maybe it will cease or change. It gave me a message saying that I have changed the language to Spanish. Are you hearing me in Spanish or in English? Prasad?
No, it's English.
English.
We're hearing
Yeah.
English, yeah. So it's no problem.
Message. A spurious message, yeah. Okay,
That's interesting.
go on. So for instance, one of the strong conditionings we have from our own experience is that with many of the material problems, such as learning a language or making a garden or building a home, we make a plan, we get the experts, we consult the experts how to execute it, we get hold of the tools to execute it, and then work hard to achieve that end. And it has been our experience that this method is successful. It works in the physical and material realm, but it doesn't work in the spiritual realm. You cannot become non-violent in this by this process, or peaceful by this process, and so on. And that kind of approach itself feeds the ego in the person. If you have achieved, you feel fulfillment. If you don't achieve, you feel frustration, and so on, which are the consequences of a egoistic approach. So it strengthens the egoistic approach. And the ego is the biggest sickness in the mind. If you are approaching egoistically, all problems are the creation of that. So really speaking, our approach itself adds to the burden. We rely on memory, on thought, on analysis, and he points out in different chapters the dangers of doing that, the limitations of analysis, the dangers of looking for methods to get rid of this and following certain methods, which means you have already the desire to get rid of it. And as we said in previous sessions, any desire, however noble the aim of that desire may be, feeds the ego. The desire itself is a problem. And when you don't realize that you are really doing that, when you are creating an ideal and wanting to work towards that ideal, you end up having this division between what is and what should be. And that creates conflict within oneself, and this conflict is a waste of energy. We went into that in one of the previous sessions, so I won't deliberate on it for long. So we are constantly making a wrong turn because we have not seen the falseness of all this for ourselves, and that complicates the investigation that we are doing. So he suggests not using the intellect and thinking and reason to solve this issue, but just be aware of what is going on. The action of awareness, he says, is very different from the action of thought or conclusion or desire. All those are still within the ego field, and that is contributing to the burden. So with a burdened mind, one cannot solve the burden. This is like Einstein's statement that with the same kind of thinking that created the problem, you cannot solve the problem. You have to go to a higher level of thinking. He said that in the field of science, which is more or less an intellectual field, though it's coupled with observation. But it is based on reason. And reason and intellect have a limited role here because they can create the question at a deeper level, but they can't answer the question. The answer, namely the truth, lies beyond the known. And so it needs an insight, and the insight is blocked. By this very approach, the insight is blocked. So if you see the danger of this, you don't depend on this thought process and rational process to arrive at a conclusion which then you want to implement in your life. So you don't separate action from the investigation. It's not that you investigate, you come to a conclusion, then you apply that conclusion and make action. That creates a division between the analyzer and the analyzed, which is an unreal distinction, an illusory distinction. The one who is analyzing is also sick. But the feeling comes that there is a part of me which is sick and there is another part which is healthy. And can I expand the healthy part and cover the sick part or get rid of the sick part? And he points out that this itself is an illusory process. The whole of the mind is sick when a part of it is sick. Just as if your body is sick, you can't say only my hand is sick and not my leg. It's all connected. And so you have to look at the body as a whole. And the attention gets drawn only to that part which is producing the pain, and so it is not holistic. And so the insight or the perception is partial. And that is not the truth. That is not the whole truth. It may be a truth. So this method of actively getting rid of one illusion in the mind at a time is a time process. And he points out that it is true that an illusion can be ended with an insight, but it's a partial insight. It ends one illusion, but there are 100 other illusions in the mind. And so the burden or the problem doesn't go. And if you use this time process of gradually getting rid of one illusion at a time, in the time you're adding to the burden through your experiences and your conclusions with this sick mind. So it's like a bucket with a hole which you are trying to fill from the top. You're also filling it and you're also emptying it at the same time. It'll never empty. So that's why I said it's rather deep waters, because what do we do if we don't use our mind? Now he is pointing out that we have this other tool of awareness, not thinking and reason, but awareness, just watching what is going on, paying full attention to what is going on. But that full attention is not possible when there is all this distraction going on, the chattering mind. So the very perception or awareness that this chattering mind is blocking me, when that is a realization, then it stops. So only then there is what he calls transformation of consciousness. So to go from the conclusion which reason can give you to the perception of a truth, that is a pathless bit. There is no method, no way by which you can get there. And if that is your aim, that becomes a desire process, and that itself strengthens the ego within the consciousness, makes it more difficult. So the very approach we are taking is from the sick mind, and it is continually blocking us. So he says even the intellectual, the professor of philosophy and so on, is blocking himself. He's not aware of this process, because the mind, the intellect is only one fragment of your personality. So the senses had to be included in the investigation. It's not just an intellectual investigation. It has to be coupled with the senses, and therefore he says must be connected with observing one's consciousness as it is functioning in daily life, in relationship, not only relationship with people, but with religion, with ideas, with society, all relationship, with yourself, with this burden, how you are relating. The quality of that observation is more important than your conclusion or your rational thought process, because that's what complicates. So it becomes a sort of vicious circle, wherein the very process of investigating is adding to the burden, and I'm wanting to get rid of the burden. So that's a vicious circle in which one is trapped. You can be aware of this process, see the danger of it, and it can cease. But you can't get rid of it through practicing some method and so on, which is what religion suggested, they become escapes, methods of meditation, methods of watching your breath and so on. They produce temporary results, but they don't eliminate the cause of the problem. And so long as the cause exists, the psychological consequences of it are there, present. And therefore, it becomes a waste of energy. At least that is what I understood him to be pointing out in all these chapters, in different ways, to different people who came to him with different problems. But the central theme or stream which runs through this is that the burdened mind cannot get rid of the burden by methods which are part of the burden, which add to the burden. So it needs a totally different quality of observation, which is why that one of the persons who approached him says, "You are asking me to come to it with a healthy mind when I am having a sick mind." And he says, "No, that's not what I am saying." So we have to take that into consideration, that he is not saying you have to have a healthy mind, but you have to see the danger, be aware of the danger of the unhealthy mind, instead of thinking that there is a corner that is healthy and I will expand that corner and eliminate the illness. It's not like that. It's not like an infection that comes from outside and you take antibiotics, get rid of the infection, and the body comes back to health. Of course, you have side effects which slowly heal in the body, but that process is not applicable in the psychological realm. So that's the difficulty of the sickness, psychological sickness. And the extreme cases are, of course, mentally ill patients. They find it extremely difficult to come out of that mental illness. And it just persists, and the doctors help you to cope with that condition by giving chemicals and so on. So this is a question which we need to seriously examine and look at. As I have pointed out in earlier talks, it has no value to accept what Krishnamurti has said or to reject it. The rejecting it is a conclusion. The accepting it is a feeling that he is an authority, he has gone very deep into it, and what he is pointing out must be the truth. Because truth is not an idea. A correct description of the truth is possible through reason. But that description is not the described. So to come upon the actuality, the realization of it, one has to rely on this watching, keeping the conditioning and the thought process in abeyance. And that is elsewhere in other sessions. He has talked about other chapters. He talked about the need for a silent mind. Now, to give a rather elementary example of this, when you go to see a movie, if your mind is constantly chattering, saying, "Oh, that other movie was far superior, this actor was acting much better, that actor was acting much better than what this actor is acting, and I wish they had chosen that man," and so on, so on, so on. The mind is constantly chattering. You're not able to pay full attention to what the movie is trying to communicate. It may be boring or it may be interesting. That's a different matter. But you are not paying full attention to what you are not able to pay full attention because your own mind is chattering all the time. It's not from going with a friend who is all the time commenting on the movie and therefore prevents you from paying attention to the movie. That's an experience which all of us have had. But Krishnamurti is saying it doesn't have to be a friend. This conditioning in your mind is also chattering. So we ourselves are also distracting, not only the colleague who is talking to us. I recall that when we went for walks with Krishnamurti, he didn't want us to talk to him because that talking became a distraction from seeing what is going on around. And he was keen on watching nature, seeing the beauty of it. So we were instructed to walk silently with him so that we don't disturb his mind. And you can see that in the descriptions of nature, which are there in every chapter, because these chapters are really from his diary. He didn't write that for public, he was writing that for himself. That is the description of the day, which included the walk and included this dialogue with a person who has come to meet him. You will notice that in that he just describes factually what he is saying without giving his reactions that, oh, this was good, this was bad. Very rarely does that happen. Most of the time it is just observing the poverty, the disease, the beauty in the environment. That kind of approach, which has no desire in it, which is paying attention without demanding anything for itself, is an approach of love. And he says, without this love, everything goes wrong. And this love is to observe, to watch, without the interference of desire, without ambition. Just to watch. Maybe the desire to learn is there. That's all right. That's not an egoistic desire. So don't blame desire, but be aware of what kind of desire creates an ego and what kind of desire does not create an ego. So you have to have a right understanding of our relationship with desire. If you try to get rid of desire, it goes wrong. If you try to promote desire, it goes wrong. We have discussed that in previous sessions. So the problem is not with desire. The problem is how we relate with desire and how we understand the consequences of that relationship. Desire can be very energizing. You need desire even to watch, to pay attention. But when it is seeking an end result, it turns egoistic. It's very subtle. So that is what he means by the quality of the mind. If the quality is one of love, it's a high quality. And that quality can solve the problem. I think last week he pointed out that how we should treat a child with a tantrum or a difficult child with aggressive one. And there also he pointed out that if you approach it with fear, with discipline, with threats, you are adding to his insecurity. And that insecurity is causing him his aggression. So that's a false approach. If you keep him on your lap and make him feel completely secure that you are his friend, you will help him with this problem, solve this problem. Maybe it can solve, it can change the nature of the brain cells in his brain. which means he can really bring about a transformation in the child. So, to drop this burden and approach the issue afresh with awareness, without any reliance on reason and analysis and so on, which has become a strong habit because it has been promoted in our education, also in our growing up, in our family and so on. Always thought process has been given a lot of importance, and the danger of it or the limitations of it have not really been clearly pointed out by anybody, neither in school nor college nor home. So the mind is trapped in an illusion, and that is the burden which we carry. And with this burden, it becomes very difficult to come upon truth, because the very perception itself is colored. Your reactions themselves are colored. And therefore, you're not able to see, you're not able to have an insight. You might have an intuition, but intuition includes a contribution from your memories, from your background. And therefore, it can be confused for an insight, but it may not be a real insight. You have to examine carefully whether it's an insight or it's an intuitive feeling. Not that all intuitive feelings need to be avoided and so on. You have to watch that also, whether that is producing what are the consequences of that, whether it's creating division, disorder in consciousness and so on, or it's an innocent illusion. Innocent illusions are like fairy tales. They don't create disorder. So I'll end it here. As I said, these chapters take us into deeper waters. We need to listen to it and look at it through observation of our own consciousness in daily life in order to really grasp the truth about it. The truth is not so easy to come upon because it's not just an intellectual conclusion. Thank you. I'll end it here and we can discuss some of these problems. I may have missed some things which he said in these chapters, but you are free to ask questions if you have read them and you have a question about it, feel free to ask that. It doesn't have to be related only to what I have said just now.
Thank you very much, Professor Krishna.
You're welcome.
So now we can begin our question and answer portion of the lecture today. We already have a couple of questions. I will read the first one from George Selva Kumar. Krishnamurti's 1929 epoch-making speech, "Truth is a Pathless Land," marked his breaking away from the Theosophical Society. In it, he states, truth cannot be brought down. Rather, the individual must make an effort to ascend it. However, his later teachings seem to contradict this by emphasizing the non-existence of the individual and the futility of effort. Given the context of his breaking from the Theosophical Society, was his statement a reflection of his deepened insight into the truth as time went by, rather than evolving, or a strategic choice to introduce his teachings in a specific way in the later days?
It is not important for us to assess what went on in his mind. or his motives and so on. The issue for us is our own consciousness and our own disorder in daily life and the causes of it, and whether one can eliminate those causes. Whether he had done that and in what way he had done that may be of academic interest to understand Krishnamurti as a person, but it has no value by way of self-knowledge. So it becomes speculative. You don't know. We don't know what went on in his consciousness. Now, theosophists themselves have said different things. What Madame Blavatsky said is very different from what Annie Besant said and what Leadbeater said. And so there is no one view in theosophy. Different theosophists have different views, and the Theosophical Society gives freedom to people to hold their own views, but their objective is to discover the truth, which Krishnamurti was doing all through his life, and also to communicate that truth if it is communicable, to the extent to which it is communicable. Because they said that questions can be communicated, but the answers cannot be communicated because they lie at the level of perception. And perception is not communicable from the guru to the student. The Theosophical Society also had other objectives. Belief in the universal brotherhood of man. If you didn't accept that, you could not be a member of the Theosophical Society. But just because you accept that as an aim, it doesn't become a fact in your life. So within the Theosophical Society itself, there were a lot of divisions. Even today, there are half a dozen Theosophical Societies, each one of them saying truth is the highest religion. And Madame Blavatsky said, if you read her book called The Key to Theosophy, she said, don't indulge in the esoteric society until you have completely extinguished your personality. That is the same as freedom from conditioning. Now, this individual has two meanings. One is the individual as this separate body. My body is separate from yours, so Krishna's body is separate from your body. That's a fact, scientific fact. But there is also the conditioning. The conditioning is different from in each mind because their experiences are different and so on. That individuality, which comes from identification with your particular conditioning, your particular background, is an illusion, is the ego. And that makes us feel that we are separate from each other. And unless you get rid of this, brotherhood never becomes a fact. It remains only a belief. So that is the difficulty. As an objective, it's not wrong. It is very noble objective that the whole of the world, all the people, we are all brothers. That means we are all similar, which is true, which Krishnamurti also points out logically, rationally, and so on. It is possible to explain that. That the other man is yourself, not separate from you. The feeling of separate comes from identification with a fragment. And each one has decided which fragment to identify with. Now, in the current chapters which we are discussing, He's saying, don't approach life with this burden, with this conditioning. And elsewhere he has said that so long as you don't free yourself of the conditioning, no learning takes place. He's talking about learning as discerning what is true and what is false, which is part of self-knowledge. The learning of self-knowledge requires freedom from conditioning, which we have just discussed a little while ago. So there is not a very fundamental difference between what theosophy is saying, if you take that to be what Blavatsky is saying. But what Leadbeater and Annie Besant were saying is a bit different. They were talking also about the good conditioning, that goodness can come through conditioning, and that the need for social reform and so on. That is different from what Krishnamurti is talking. But the objectives, he realized that the other man is yourself. All his life, he was pursuing truth, which is the highest religion. So in a sense, he is the true theosophist. He was the true theosophist because he lived those objectives. But members of the Theosophical Society have not realized that. They are only hoping to. And therefore, they didn't understand what this man was doing. They thought that he is opposing the society, criticizing the society, and their leader was Annie Besant, and they felt that he is diverging away from Annie Besant. And with that opinion, it created a division, and they threw him out of the Theosophical Society. He said that himself. He said, I never left the Theosophical Society. They didn't want me there. And that they were people like Arundel and Leadbeater and Wedgwood and so on, who were leaders at that time when he gave the speech of 1929. So all that is past history. It's not much value for us, except as knowledge, to go into it. It's more important to pay attention to the present of our own consciousness, our own problems which we are facing, which is what Krishnamurti is discussing in every chapter. He is discussing real problems which human beings are facing, rather than historical causes. That's my response.
The next question is from Sanjay Kanodia. Good morning, Professor Krishna. Please elaborate on your point of view on the one thing which is not in books, and if you haven't that one thing, then everything goes wrong. Is it love or sensitivity?
Yes, I would say so, because we approach life through the intellect rather than with love and sensitivity. Our education also does not lay enough emphasis on cultivating sensitivity in the child. The home also doesn't do it. It requires completely different kinds of activities and exposure of the child to come upon, to help him come upon sensitivity, which is the perception of beauty in every aspect of life. As we have said before, there is beauty, great beauty in life. Beauty being the joy that you experience in engaging in that activity, whether it is literature, poetry, music, nature, sports, art. In everything there is beauty, and that beauty is only perceived when you have sensitivity. And sensitivity is not a thought process. It develops through contact. So you have to create such experiences, such contact for the child. And that requires leisure. And our present educational system doesn't believe in giving leisure. It wants to engage because it is so busy wanting the child to achieve what they have laid down as courses for intellectual development or for skill development and so on. So the whole focus is in producing an artist or an engineer or a doctor who will do the work in society, for society, and earn a livelihood. That's a very limited purpose to make for education. It doesn't concern yourself with the happiness of the child, whether he'll be creative or he'll be an egoist. They're not concerned. They don't mind if you are an egoist. In fact, ego is promoted in most educational institutions. And then we complain that this man has become egoistic, he doesn't love. But we have never given importance to love. Love being motive which is not self-centered. Krishnamurti says, love is where the self is not. We have not promoted that. We have promoted the self-centered motive. We have promoted the idea of success, of achievement, and made heroes of people who have achieved more than other people, and so on. So the whole thing takes you off into a different direction altogether. And that's what Krishnamurti calls the wrong turn. I mean, nature gave us enhanced capacity for imagination, for thinking, for memory over the animal. But it did not say that we must use these capacities to constitute the ego. We need these capacities, but we have not learned what is the right use of these capacities and what is the wrong use. Wrong in not some moral sense, but in the sense that it creates division, it creates hatred, creates negative emotions in the consciousness, and therefore violence and sickness and all that, the burden. So that's the wrong turn. Nature is not responsible for it because it has not determined which way we will take it, which way we will use these. Evolution just gave us these enhanced capacities. It didn't dictate which way we will use it. And we have not learned to use them in the right direction. None of them is in itself a problem. You need all of them. And yet, if you don't have self-knowledge, you enter into the ego realm, and then it goes wrong. So, can you come back and live with love and compassion and joy and happiness, not with all these negative emotions, which are the creation of our own mind, because we have not learned the right use of thought, the right use of imagination, and we are constituting illusions out of that instead of using it for learning, this kind of learning, which we call self-knowledge. Yeah, that's my response.
Next we have next we have a question from Nina. How do we let the teachings be alive in a Krishnamurti school without turning them into a recipe or blueprint for action.
Meenaji, there is no how. There are methods which one should not use because any methods that promote the ego are obviously damaging to the child and to life. So competition, use of reward and punishment are all out of the window. But that is not, doesn't mean the ego will not happen. So it's not enough. You must not promote the ego in the child, but the ego will still form. It may not be a large ego because you are not promoting it, but it will not go away without self-knowledge. So you have to also promote this inquiry, which may begin with the intellect, but eventually it comes to the level of insight or perception. If you point out the difference between an intellectual conclusion and a perception. So all this needs to be included in education at the appropriate age. Not every child, you can't do this with a 5-year-old child. He won't understand any of this. But the 5-year-old child can be treated in such a way as to promote sensitivity in the child. So right from the beginning, the education, its concerns being more holistic, is concerned with the body, with the mind, with the emotions, with the spiritual, the spirit in which the child is growing up. And that means we all teachers must also relate that way. We must be free from violence, from jealousy, from suspicion, and so on. So we have to understand all this so that the whole atmosphere in the school is free from violence, from suspicion, from jealousy, from rivalry, competition, and so on. And that is the difficulty of creating a Krishnamurti school. So Krishnamurti talked about educating the educator. There is a book with that title by him, where he gave talks to educators. And he said, educating the educator is more necessary than even educating the child, because the child is very amenable. You can teach him, but the educator is not so amenable. He already has condition fixed in his ideas and he resists learning. But that is the difficulty of creating a Krishnamurti school. But the vision is clear. What needs to be done is clear. It doesn't say that it is easy to do that, because we ourselves have become difficult. So the problem is not the child, the problem is the teacher. After all, the child meets the mind of the teacher. He doesn't meet the mind of Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti is in the brochure of the Krishnamurti school. He's dead and gone. You are no longer in contact with him. You are in contact with your daily teacher. And he is conditioned, he is having all kinds of ideas about what is love, what is culture, and what reward and punishment, whether you should be used, whether fear should be used, all that. He comes from a normal education where all this was promoted. So that's a great difficulty, how to create that atmosphere, which then in turn educates the child. Child is not educated by what you speak in the classroom. He is educated by what he sees going on around him.
Are we ready for the next question, or would you like to say more words for the previous question, Professor?
No, no, no. My response is over.
Okay, great. The next question is from Salvador Rojas. Good evening, Professor Krishna. Would you differentiate the burden, the mind, the consciousness, and the ego in order to make these clear?
Intellectually, I can, but that's, as I said, the intellect is a limited faculty. It can describe, but it can't give you the insight. So you mustn't take these answers as the truth. You must investigate for yourself in order to find out whether they are true or not. So consciousness you are born with. The child is born, as soon as he is born, he is conscious, he is aware. Awareness is the intrinsic quality of consciousness. There is a dispute between scientists whether it is product of brain or it is independent of the brain, separate from the brain. They don't know. It seems to have a dimension which is completely different from the mechanical. So you can combine hydrogen and chlorine and make hydrochloric acid, which has different properties than the properties of hydrogen and chlorine. So is the consciousness like that a property of material brain in the brain coming together in a certain structure? That's the question. And there are scientists who say, including Roger Penrose, who's one of the top scientists from Oxford, that it is dimensionally different. Awareness is something dimensionally different. You can't create that out of matter, and therefore it must be something separate from matter. But in their theory about the universe, it is matter that got created first. So the question is still open as to what brought about awareness and how awareness arises. They don't know. The scientists don't know, neither the biologists nor. They know the elements of it, the RNA, DNA, and so on, yeah. But they don't know how exactly consciousness arises, and nobody has been able to create life in the laboratory from chemicals which are non-living, inert. So that's still an open question. What Krishnamurti has said about it is that consciousness is something quite separate from the brain. And he says the mind is outside the brain. The brain has memory, it is mechanical, it is like a computer. The feelings may also be computerized, which is the conditioning. That's the computerization, the program in the individual brain. But awareness is not a program. It doesn't have a structure. So we don't know how awareness arises. And the religious people, including Krishnamurti, say that it is separate from matter. Just read the question again, and there were some other elements he wanted other than consciousness and brain.
I will read the question again. Good evening, Professor Krishna. Would you differentiate the burden, the mind, the consciousness, and the ego?
Yes. So that leaves us with the other two things. One is the ego, and the other is the burden. Now, the burden is the conditioning. We talked about it today in detail. And that burden is there in the memory, in the brain. Both the memory of our experiences, the memory of our pains and pleasures, which is a psychological memory. So factual memory, psychological memory, and the ego is the attachment to all this conditioning. The conditioning per se is not the ego, because it's something that actually exists. It is there in the brain in the form of structure of neurons. It's held there in the brain. And it changes from time to time because you're adding to it and some things are disappearing from the memory also. But the attachment to this, the dependence on this, has been promoted right from childhood, and that dependence or attachment is the ego. That is a separate meaning of the individual. So when Krishnamurti says, can you observe without the observer? He's talking about awareness without the interference of the personality. The personality is also the observer because it's interacting with the observer. And the body, mind, senses are also the observer. So the word observer is used both to mean the body, mind, senses, the one who is seeing, and the conditioned part of the consciousness. These terms have not been very precisely defined. So sometimes he uses the observer to mean just the body and consciousness, and sometimes he means the personality and so on. So when he talks about the observing without the observer, he's talking without the conditioning. There he is talking about the conditioning as the part of the observer, in the observer. I hope I have made that clear, at least intellectually.
Now I will read the next question from participant. How can people in society be self-regulated so that they are okay by themselves and are not savages? Seeing one cannot leave man on his own, he may not discover anything, may not work on anything, as he must be self-regulated. Humans need to have hints in the social collective which make them not cross limits and need to know what is good and the way to the good. Humans need love, sensitivity, and an austere mind. When that goes away, all evil comes. They must have respect for it more than for the petty self. Otherwise, it is not a society but organized chaos, violence, degeneration everywhere. What structure can exist and in which way can it be communicated in all societies as this problem persists?
Krishnamurti's take on this is that the individual is not separate from the society. The individual problem, his problem in his personal life, is also the ego process in his mind, and that creates the division, that produces the violence, and millions of such people constitute society. It may arise in a slightly different way in one man and another man, but everybody is contributing to the violence. May not be at the physical level, but certainly at the consciousness level. Because at the consciousness level, if you are angry, you are violent. If you are hateful, you are violent. If you are jealous, you are violent. So all negative emotions contribute to violence. And every human being throughout the world has these, somewhere in greater measure, somewhere in a lesser measure. And the collective is just a collection of millions of such individuals. Therefore, to hope that without the individual changing, I can solve this problem is only a limitation. You are trying to control the manifestation of the violence which is there, psychological violence which is there in human beings. That's what governments are doing by having a police force, by having judges, by threatening that you will get into a prison if you do this and so on. But the threat, the fear also promotes the ego, also promotes dishonesty and so on. So it's not removing the cause of the disorder, it is merely controlling the manifestation of the disorder. Now, certain structures are more conducive to a lower manifestation of the disorder than other structures. If you promote the ego and give freedom to an individuality and so on, you have the violence you see in America. If you don't, you control it very strongly, you have the violence which you see in Russia, in communism. And socialism is an in-between blend of the two. It has control, but it also has a lot of care. And therefore, structurally, perhaps the socialist countries, the Scandinavian countries, have the least violence. But all that is the job of the government, the external structure, the control. It does not eliminate the violence. The violence is there in the human consciousness, whether he is in Scandinavia or in Russia or in India, it makes no difference. So that's what it means that the other man is yourself. He's just like you. So he said, education must concern itself with the transformation of consciousness. And that's why he wanted to change education. Because in the education, the child comes with a more or less a mind that is an empty slate. And depending on what the education writes on that slate, he becomes an egoist or he has a sensitivity. And so everything is determined in education, not education as we have organized it in schools, but everything. Education is the environment in which the child is growing. That includes the village, the city, the television, the whatever is going on in society, the newspapers, the magazine, whatever he reads, everything educates him. And the way, of course, the parents are teaching him, threatening him, and so on, so on. All that determines what that child is going to be. And sure, good conditioning is better than bad conditioning. The conditioning of a robber and a burglar is different from the conditioning of a professor of in a university. He's not a robber. But there's not a tremendous difference. This man also has ego, this man also has jealousy, ambition. All those psychological problems are present in him. So merely through good conditioning, you cannot create goodness. Goodness has to be part of the consciousness. And this was realized both by Buddha in the East and by Socrates in the West, way back 2000 years ago or more, that virtue is order in consciousness. Unless there is order in consciousness, you cannot have order in society. You can only control the disorder, which is what the jobs of the United Nations and the government, we're seeing that in operation. It doesn't work. It works to some extent, but It does not eliminate the cause of the disorder. So there is no alternative to self-knowledge, which is the key to wisdom. Without wisdom, it'll just go wrong. And you are asking, in which structure will it go wrong less? That's a social question, not a religious question. The religious question is how to end the disorder in consciousness, which is what is virtue. Order in consciousness is real virtue.
Now I would like to read the next question from Lata. I infer from chapter 16 that Krishnamurti does not give much weight to Vedanta and Upanishads. Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, seems to help identify the workings of the ego, the me and my syndrome. By realizing this, one is able to rise above the conditioning and look at life with choiceless awareness, which brings about creative intelligence. Can you please share your thoughts?
Human beings have given a lot of importance to the source of a question. Take the question, is pleasure the same thing as happiness? What difference does it make whether you get that question from Krishnamurti or from Vedanta or from Buddha or from Socrates or from your own child? Makes no difference. The question is the same. And the question is the guru if you can relate with it intelligently. That means neither accepting an answer from anybody nor rejecting what anybody is saying, but examining it for yourself in your daily life, in your consciousness, so that you don't just come to an intellectual conclusion and mistake it for the truth, but you come to a realization. So intellectual understanding is not the same thing as the realization of the truth. The intellectual understanding is easy to come upon. You can join a philosophy course in a university and get a degree, and you will have a reasonably good intellectual understanding of these issues. Or you can listen to Krishnamurti's dialogues or my videos and come upon a certain amount of conclusions and so on. But that's not the purpose. The conclusion is not the purpose. That's not the truth. Truth is at the level of perception. And perception, neither Krishnamurti can give you, nor the Buddha can give you. You have to come upon it yourself. And that is why, that's what it means. You have to be a light unto yourself. You can't get that light from the guru. The question is important, but not the source of the question. You give a lot of importance to the source of the question. What difference does it make whether it comes from the Vedanta, or it comes from Ramana Maharshi, or it comes from Krishnamurti, or it comes from David Bohm, or from your readings, or your child comes and asks that question? The source is not important. Your approach to the question is important. And therefore, it's entirely our own responsibility. Our own learning is our own responsibility.
Thank you, Professor. We have a question now from Kartik Gupta. If one has to accept the problem created by another as what is, how to approach it to remove the conflict between the two persons?
what is not the acceptance of a problem, whether created by yourself or by another person, external source. What is what is actually taking place in your consciousness and the consequences of that. That needs a lot of attention, not with a mind that is judging, saying this is good, that is bad, and interfering with the observation or controlling it. Just watching that phenomenon intimately, with love, with interest, not with the desire to change it, anything. Like you watch the planets, how did the scientists look at the planets? They couldn't change anything, but they watched very carefully. They measured what they could watch and measure, and then gradually came upon the fact that the planets are rotating around the sun, and so on. So in the same way, can you watch your consciousness? Much more difficult, because your desires don't interfere in your observing the planets. But here, you're watching your own consciousness and your own ambition and desires and likes and dislikes enter very strongly into your observation. That's why it's very difficult to be objective in the religious quest as compared with the scientific quest. So the scientific quest has progressed very much. We have discovered many truths about nature, but we have remained primitive as far as our understanding of consciousness is concerned. When you understand that understanding is not just an intellectual phenomenon, the deeper understanding is the realization of that truth in your own consciousness, not just the intellectual understanding. In science, the intellectual understanding works. The formula works. The engineers don't know how the formula came, but they use the formula to make the bridge or make the car, whatever it is, and it works. But there is no formula in the religious quest. There is no such contribution of the intellect which helps you, except the creation of the question and the communication of the question. So whenever you read a book, doubt the opinions expressed in the book. Even if it is Krishnamurti's book, doesn't matter whose book. Because accepting what is being said by that man, not important for you, your understanding. But questioning it is important, because in investigating that question, through observation, through senses, including the mind, a deep insight can occur which reveals to you the truth. But it will not occur when you are egoistic, when you are approaching it only intellectually and so on, because truth is a holistic perception, not a fragmentary perception.
The next question is from T.S. Sarma. How to recognize the sickness or absence of it in our mind, except for the root cause, i.e., the ego? What are the other symptoms that can be looked out for? We are again observing, realizing, or not realizing it with the same mind, with our conditioning.
Every time you experience a negative emotion, whether it is frustration, boredom, jealousy, anger, hatred, and so on. It's an opportunity to learn about your own consciousness. From where does it arise in my consciousness? How does it develop? And what are the consequences of it in my life, in my relationships, in my sleep, in my daily life? That needs a lot of patience. You have to stay with that question and not quickly answer it, much less get the answer from somebody else. Because the answer given by somebody else may be his insight, but for you, it's just an idea. And ideas are a dime a dozen. You can read any book and you can get tremendous ideas in it. You start admiring those ideas and admiring the book and so on. All that is entertainment, intellectual entertainment. Nothing wrong with it, but it's not part of self-knowledge. It's not increasing your wisdom or understanding of life. So if that is clear, there is various forms of entertainment. One is not saying don't see a cinema. One is not saying don't go out with a friend and join a party. One is not saying that. But keep watching. There is this verse in the Upanishads of two birds sitting on a tree. It's a metaphor which says the first bird is nibbling on the fruit in the tree and tasting the bitterness or sourness or sweetness of the fruit. And the second bird is just watching what this bird is doing. And the learning comes from the second bird. Now, the metaphor is the first bird is the ego, and the second bird is awareness, just simply watching what is going on. And the verse says, the human consciousness is both these birds in one. That means there is a conditioned part and there is the unconditioned part, namely the awareness. Whether you use the first part or the second part to watch and analyze and all that depends on you, which in turn depends on how aware you are of the danger of the ego, of the conditioning, which is what we have talked about whole of today in detail. And if you have realized that that only complicates things, maybe solves some problems partially, but not wholly, and adds to the burden of the mind, then the approach changes. You don't use that. You use the awareness. So Krishnamurti says the awareness of the burden and the consequences of that burden has a very different action from your conclusion, your opinion, your efforts, which are coming from the ego. And that has that different quality of the mind can solve the problem. But the same kind of mind which created the problem cannot solve the problem. When the ego is not there, that is the area, that's the realm of love.
Thank you, Professor. And now I will read the last question for tonight from Sri Vipra Jivaratinam. When you see the falseness of religion, having young children under one's care, also having a brain that is not quiet, and a family that is vehemently walking with religion and rituals like never before, any outward action brings chaos. Not participating in religious activities is possible, but one finds this action alone insufficient. Staying with what is, and also seeing the desire to be with K and his associates, as one sees that there is truth amidst all the chaos and untruth around, one can be frustrated. Why is silence not naturally occurring, sir? Is watching all this choicelessly the only right action?
Somebody will say yes and somebody else will say no. And then where are you? So never ask this kind of answer from another person. You will get different opinions. And opinions are not truths. Truth is at the level of perception. So it's a complex question. The human being consciousness is a very complex thing. And one is trying to understand that, the working of that. You have to observe choicelessly. Otherwise, you add to the complication, is what we pointed out today. What Krishnamurti has pointed out in these chapters. You have to take that as a question that what is this energy of love? I know the energy of the ego, the ambition, the ideal to be achieved, and the effort I make towards achieving that ideal, all that is very concrete, but that builds the ego. So there is tremendous energy which comes from the ego, but it's a destructive energy. It produces construction in one part and creates destruction in another part. So is there an energy or a passion that is not coming from the ego? That is the deeper question. And the answer is yes. There is the energy of love. Love being the absence of self-centered motive. You are not energized by a self-centered motive. You are not looking for a profit or name or fame or gain, either psychological profit or material profit for yourself. You are just looking at it because you want to understand life. And that's a passion without an ego. And that's the passion of love. To discover that passion, that alone is something which will transform, which will change things. All your thinking, all your effort, all your knowledge cannot do that because it adds to the burden, as we have pointed out. At least that's what Krishnamurti is pointing to. You don't have to accept this because accepting it is a problem. Now, to your practical question of family life, there is no problem in going to the church or the temple or performing the ritual and so on. The problem is that you think that if you think that all this is making you virtuous, it's an illusion. You're not becoming virtuous by doing that ritual. It is merely a way of paying your respects to something which you don't even understand what it is, but you have accepted something called God, either in the form of a statue or in your imagination, whether at home or in the temple. So one is not saying don't do this. Krishnamurti is not saying that. There is no do this, don't do this. He's saying do whatever you are doing, but watch why you are doing it, the motive with which you are doing it. Watch the consequences of it. Keep the second bird alive. Don't just do it for fun. Nothing wrong with doing it for fun, but not just for fun. Keep the second bird alive. It's watching what the first bird is doing. So what the Upanishad is saying in that metaphor is what Krishnamurti is also saying. As far as I understand it, I may be mistaken. So don't accept anything that I say. These are all sharing questions, not answers. One has to investigate all this for oneself. If you love to investigate, you don't have to do it as a moral compulsion. No. That will become another egoistic process. You're doing it in order to achieve a result. It's an egoistic process. So it's very subtle. You have to do this inquiry itself for the love of it, for the joy of it, if you feel a joy in it. Thank you. I think we should end it here.
Would you like to give the assignments out for the next readings? Is it the next 5 chapters for the 19th or 20th for if you're in India?
I have not yet read them, but I will, and then we can discuss it.
So 21 through 25?
In case I feel that it would be repetitive and it's better to take up some other chapters, I will write to Prasad and he will send you an email giving you another 5 chapters from a different part of the book. But I think we should continue with the chapters. Even repetition also, because it's not a field of knowledge. It's not that you have received the answer and you don't need to investigate that again. There is an interesting video of Krishnamurti starting a dialogue. I don't remember whether it's in Rockwood or India or Ojai. That's not important. He asks, "Sir, what would you like to discuss?" And one man says, "Let's discuss desire." And another man says, "No, sir, we discussed that last week." So he immediately stops this man and says, "Just a minute, sir. Have you solved the problem of desire? If not, why shouldn't we discuss it again?" So if you're only looking for intellectual answers, there is repetition. But otherwise, there is no such thing as repetition. You are investigating again, you don't know when you will go beyond the known and come upon an insight. So there is no problem in investigating the same question again, which you have investigated in the last week. Because this is not accumulating conclusions from your previous investigations. It is an awakening of intelligence, which makes the mind keener and makes it very perceptive. Immediately it perceives. Doesn't take long time and discussion and so on in order to perceive the truth. That intelligence is different. It is what we call wisdom. And that is different from the intelligence as we describe in society, which is just the ability or cleverness at a particular function. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Krishna.
Thank you, Professor Krishna.
Thank you very much. God bless.
Thank you, sir.